Kids haven't quite settled down yet. Okay, gang. All right. Okay, I want to get started. You remember now in this second of the three parts of the course, we started out by discussing the general structure of the Constitution. It's Part A and Part B, as I said, and there are philosophical implications to the fact that there were these two separate parts of the Constitution, having to do with the attitudes with regard to the powers of the central government versus the resistance to giving certain powers to them and being very clear about that. That's a philosophical aspect of the creation of the Constitution. And we dealt with that whole thing to begin with. In that discussion, you remember that we kind of set aside the whole issue of the first 10 amendments. We moved from Part A and Part B, and I gave you a list of a lot of the additional amendments that had been passed since the Bill of Rights, but I segregated out the Bill of Rights and sort of set them to one side because they're so important in dealing with the philosophical implications of the amendments. And so what we want to do today is we want to start turning our attention to the Bill of Rights itself, and not surprisingly, we'll start with the first amendment, specifically with the right to speech, because the freedom of speech is what you might refer to as the great-granddaddy of all of the rights that are in the Constitution. That in fact, the right to freedom of speech is in a certain sense the source of, in the manifestation of, the right of freedom of thought and freedom of belief and the freedom of expression, which actually entails art of painting and music and poetry and sculpture. All of these are considered part of the freedom of expression, which is understood to be part of the freedom of speech. And of course, the right to political belief, which is critical in a democracy, and it's critical from the point of view of political theory and political philosophy. But it also, in a certain sense, is the origin of the right of freedom of religion, because the entire idea about being able to express your religion, advocate your religion, proselytize on behalf of your religion, if one feels compelled to do so, they're all aspects of freedom of speech. And freedom of speech, of course, in turn, tends to give rise to the right to freedom of association, because people tend to gather together in groupings predicated upon the expressed beliefs of the people who are members of that group. So that I want to start our discussion, our substantive discussion of the Bill of Rights with this specific right of freedom of speech. Now, I could have undertaken a number of different ways of getting ourselves into this all-important discussion. I could have moved to the Constitution and pointed out to you that there are, in fact, in the Bill of Rights, in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, there are actually some 46 specific substantive provisions in just the first 10 amendments. There are 46 specific areas of constitutional law that occur in the Bill of Rights that become the subject of major discussions and confrontations and litigations down through the years. And what I could have done in the class is I could have taken all 46 of these, and then we could have undertaken an in-depth historical analysis of what the kind of activities were that had been engaged in by various kings and courts and barons and others down through the history of Europe preceding the Pilgrims coming here to North America that had given rise to the felt need on the part of the framers to identify these specific rights in the Constitution. So we could have done that with regard to all 46 of these provisions. And then we could have reviewed the actual debates and discussions that went on in the colonies about those particular kinds of practices, what kind of steps were taken with regard to the colonial governments to either respect or disrespect those types of those rights. And we could have then looked at the debates that went on in the Continental Congress and in the Constitutional Convention, discussing each of these as to why it should be in the initial Bill of Rights that we're going to go in bang just like that in 1791, virtually immediately after the ratification in 1789 of Part A of the Constitution. And this analysis of the debates and discussions that went on in the colonial governments and in the Constitutional Convention prior to the setting forth of these rights would have been viewed as what they call the legislative history of each of these provisions as to how it got into there and what the intent was on the part of the framers that put those rights specifically in because that becomes a means of doing interpretation of what those rights really were understood to have meant at the time. And then, of course, we would have undertaken a detailed review of the history of the judicial decisions that have been made by the United States Supreme Court, by the various appellate courts in the federal system regarding each one of these 46 provisions, all the way from 1789 up to today. Now, as you might see, that would be a fairly extensive and in-depth analysis of all of these provisions in the Constitution. And this is the kind of experience that those of you who choose to go to law school will actually have. I was fortunate if I took constitutional law courses at the undergraduate level at Harvard College, wrote my honors thesis in the area of constitutional law, went on up to Harvard Law School and took virtually every course they had available at Harvard Law School in constitutional law, and ended up, as you know, as being the co-founder of the Harvard Civil Rights Law Review. So I've made kind of a special focus of my entire attention in dealing with the law, the whole issue of the Constitution. So I know how we would go about if I were given the ideal opportunity to have everyone here for a full year course to go into the details of each of these fundamental provisions and cover each of these half dozen different areas of their historical origins, their legislative history, their specific decisions that have come down with regard to them in the Supreme Court. But we don't have time to do that in simply a one-quarter course. And so what I also could have done is I could have selected a handful of these particular rights, and then we could have turned to the spectrum of alternative worldviews that we've talked about here and discussed how the adherents to each of these worldviews actually would understand this particular right, whether it be the right of free speech or the right of privacy or the right to practice your religion or any of the other of the 46 of them, right to a jury trial, right to a grand jury indictment. There's a whole series of these 46 particular rights. And the adherence to the 8 worldviews that we talked about, they range all the way from the authoritarian worldview to the utopian worldview. We could have gone into some length about just a small handful of these particular rights and how they'd be perceived by these adherents to these worldviews. But again, that would tend to limit the number of particular rights that you could become familiar with. So what I've decided to do instead of those kind of much more in-depth processes, what I've decided that I'm going to do is I'm going to select 4 of the basic rights that you've probably heard the most about. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to select just 4 of the worldviews for various reasons which I'll go into because they're more salient at the present time. And we'll discuss these 4 fundamental rights from the perspective of these 4 different worldviews. And I think that'll give you a real capacity to be able to understand the interface from a philosophical point of view between the constitutional rights that have been set forth in the Bill of Rights and these worldviews. Because this, in short, is not a full-scale law school class. This is predominantly a philosophy class, trying to understand the philosophy of the Bill of Rights so that when we get to part 3 of the course, we can start to address the particular secular crisis that I believe is on the way and how one could concretely utilize these rights that we're talking about as tools for assisting us in addressing this upcoming crisis. Now, the particular rights that I'm going to be addressing here in part 2 of the course is we're going to start out, I mentioned, with freedom of speech because of its kind of seminal value underlying the concept of freedom of thought and freedom of belief and the political philosophy that you develop and the associations that you would want to undertake based upon a common set of beliefs as expressed through your free speech. We'll also address the issue of the right of privacy, because that's a big issue now with the surveillance on all your telephones and emails and Google searches and everything. And plus, it's played an extraordinarily central role in the history of the development of constitutional law. The third of the issues that I'm going to be dealing with is the Fifth Amendment right to due process of law, which appears not only in the Fifth Amendment but the 14th Amendment, which also has the issue of equal rights in it, which is viewed to be a fundamental precept of due process, is that people be entitled to the same rights regardless of one's race or ethnic origins and political beliefs, etc. And the fourth one that I'm going to want to address is rather expansive. It's the Ninth Amendment that we talked about, that specifically states that just because the framers chose to set forth in the first 10 amendments specific enumerated fundamental rights that were to remain sacrosanct over and against the federal government, does not mean that there are not other fundamental rights that belong to individual human beings as a natural law right. And so that I want to deal with this Ninth Amendment fundamental concept of the existence of natural law rights. Okay, so that now the particular worldviews that we're going to be looking at, or from the perspective of which we're going to be looking at these 4 fundamental human rights, are going to be the initial first paradigm worldview, which is that extreme right-wing authoritarian worldview, because this is the original worldview that tended to govern Western culture, with the royalists and the ecclesial class combined together to form an authoritarian government originating in Rome and continuing on through the nation states with the royalist families that were ordained by the Pope. So we're going to deal from the perspective of this first paradigm to help give us some sense of an historical perspective on the origins of these particular rights. Then we're going to look at the second paradigm, the reactionary worldview, because the reactionary worldview is much in vogue right now with the Federalist Society, the right-wing members of the court. That we've got the it's since the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 and his appointment of a whole series of reactionary judges that followed upon Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, who was elected in 1968 after Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, and he appointed people like William Rehnquist to the bench. Scalia and Thomas attempted to appoint people like Robert Bork to the Supreme Court with the self-conscious attempt to impose upon the entire judicial interpretive process a reactionary stamp. And that, of course, since the end of the Cold War, that there have been additional appointments to Nixon and Reagan's appointees of John Roberts and Alito, and so that we now have, we have Scalia and Thomas and Roberts and Alito, and we have Kennedy, Justice Kennedy, who was also appointed by Reagan. So we have 5 judges on the present United States Supreme Court, and a similar ratio of reactionary judges that have been appointed to the federal courts of appeals and district courts throughout the country by these people, by Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, that they consciously sought out young reactionary lawyers to put on the federal judiciary to impose this stamp. So because of that, we're going to be looking from the perspective of the second paradigm worldview to understand what it is that they believe these rights stand for and what type of constrictions they think are legitimate to impose upon them. And the third of the 4 worldviews, from the perspective of which we'll be examining these 4 fundamental rights, this right to free speech, the right of privacy, the right to due process, and this bundle of Ninth Amendment rights. The third of the 4 worldviews is going to be the 6th paradigm, natural law worldview. That should come as no surprise, since I believe that to be the kind of the core of the perspective that we want to really come to understand, because this 6th paradigm, natural law worldview, will be, in effect, the holy grail of the advocates of civil rights and individual liberties during the upcoming crisis. And I'm hoping that you will be leaders in advocating the efficacy of these rights during this upcoming confrontation that we expect. And the 4th and final of the worldviews will be the 4th paradigm worldview, the majoritarian, utilitarian worldview, or the moderate worldview, because this is the worldview that has been adopted by the new, more moderate Democratic Party subsequent to the end of the Cold War. And they have the new Democratic Leadership Conference, and Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, all of these people are now inveterate moderates. And the fact is that virtually all 4 of the other justices that are on the Supreme Court, other than these reactionaries, are moderates. And the media talk about the liberals on the Supreme Court and the conservatives on the Supreme Court, but there are really none of any of those. All they have is reactionaries and moderates on the Supreme Court in a classic 5-4 split. And Justice Kennedy kind of bobs back and forth between these two and ends up being the deciding vote in 80% of all the cases. And therefore, 80% of all of the rights that we have as citizens are basically being determined by Justice Kennedy in his swapping back and forth between this reactionary worldview and also this moderate worldview. And so this process, this pedagogical methodology that I'm proposing for us here is designed to give you a more philosophical understanding of the constitutional rights, so that you can embed it in your cells, and so that as you move into any additional classes regarding the Constitution, you can have this whole kind of philosophical and kind of cellularly grounded perspective on these rights, and then you can undertake the longer process at law school of going through all 46 of them that are in the Bill of Rights and going through these 7 or 8 processes of each step that you might want to look at to understand them in complete detail. So the bottom line is I want us to begin dealing with this, and I want to do just a quick, and I do mean quick, review to familiarize you with these 4 particular worldviews so that you'll understand as we approach each of the fundamental rights that you'll hold this in mind. Okay? Now you remember on the extreme right end of the political spectrum, you have your authoritarian worldview. Yes?
Sorry if this seems off topic, but would you have any recommendations for books that we could read outside of class that would give us a good grasp on the worldviews in more depth? I don't know. I was looking for...
What I'm probably going to have to do is I'm probably going to have to put up the monograph up onto the e-commons for you that I've done the research on it and dug this out. The fact of the matter is there's not a lot of writing on this. This is sort of a kind of, in a sense, closely kept secret that is guarded on the part of the people at Harvard College and Harvard Law School and other places where they teach people who they think are going to be governors, basically. But I've got this whole major monograph about it, and I'll pull out the sections on it. In fact, we put up some of it, but I'll pick the rest of it.
World Future Institute Lab website, which has all broken down into the worldviews.
Oh, it does. What is it? Where is it?
worldfutureinstitutelab.org.
The World Future Institute Lab.org. Is that us or somebody else? Oh, that's us. Okay. The World Future Institute Lab.org. And it has this there. Okay? So now, remember, this first paradigm, as I said, remember, that this is the worldview that is adhered to by those who, in fact, believe that the world is the manifestation of chaos, that the universe is expanding and disintegrating all at the same time, will ultimately disintegrate into nothingness, and that there's no real naturally discernible coherent principles functioning in the universe. And therefore, the only way to effectuate order within a society is to superimpose the order on the part of an authoritative or authoritarian person who is capable of internally consistent, coherent thought and is able to superimpose on the culture a set of principles and norms that can be followed. And if followed, will in fact lend a certain order and coherence to the society. The second paradigm worldview that I talked to you about, the reactionary worldview, as distinct from the authoritarian worldview, is based upon a bipolar experience of the universe, believing that the universe actually expands and contracts eternally, expanding into a state of absolute energy and condensing into a state of absolute mass, and that in between those oscillations, the magnum annus, as they call it, there are certain confluences of mass and energy that give rise to planets and solar systems and physical beings that are a confluence of mass and energy that in fact demonstrate and display consciousness. Yes, Sophia and Tom.
Tom, go first.
Okay. So, I understand what you're saying about reactionaries. Is it common amongst most reactionaries that they actually believe this? Because I'm sure I've met a lot of reactionaries, and we've talked about science and global warming and that sort of thing, but they don't go into talking about, I believe that the universe expands and contracts.
This is a fundamental question, and what this is that the thoroughgoing thinkers that espouse a reactionary worldview do a thorough analysis of their beliefs. Most people don't. It's true. they pick this up for various reasons. We've actually ranged all the way from the theory that it's kind of a biophysically generated instinct on the part of individual persons because of the particular energy fields in their body, from the chakra system down to their social upbringing or their cultural upbringing, etc. But the bottom line is that most people are not systematic thinkers. And so the fact is that they will, out of a gestalt of some sort, attach themselves to a particular worldview. But it's extraordinarily interesting how completely consistent they remain. So that if you figure out 2 or 3 specific beliefs that they hold, you can then pretty well predict what another 8 or 10 or 20 of their beliefs are going to be. And whether they pick it up through sociology in the community with other people, through association with people like that, they tend to be very consistent and predictable. But the important thing is that the people who are thoroughgoingly systematic thinkers will in fact get to this. And that's what we encounter. That's what we encounter in the whole discussion of Talcott Parsons and Ralph Potter and others in courses that are professional courses on comparative social ethics. That the lodestone of each of these particular worldviews tends to come into manifestation the more direct attention is given to the subject. That's all. But it is true that 80% of the people who are adherents to those particular worldviews don't reflect upon it consciously. Yes, Sophia.
Okay, my question was, so all of these paradigms, ultimately, when we're talking about the cosmology, this is, what they're positing is a scientific theory.
Mm-hmm.
So, hold on, does that mean we can scientifically prove or disprove a particular worldview? That doesn't make sense.
No, because what we're saying is that the pillar beliefs about this, the cosmological beliefs, the teleological beliefs, the ontological beliefs, and the epistemological beliefs are not at the present time definitively answered. These are fundamental cosmic questions, the answer to which is extraordinarily important for derivative opinions that you have about other things. But the fact is that none of them have been definitively proven to this point. But every thinking person, a truly deep thinking person, is going to have to get to these questions in order to have a systematic method of thinking. Because the assumptions that you make in deciding whether you're going to choose option A or option B with regard to certain public policy challenges is predicated upon your assumption about reality. And when you're starting to get down to the basis of what people view to be reality, you're going to get down to these fundamental questions. Because these are determinative of the nature and makeup of absolute reality to you. And that's the reason for this. Now, this has, as I've pointed out, and I don't want to dwell on this too much because I don't want to bore you guys with this before we get to the First Amendment issue of free speech. But the bottom line is that the adherence on the part of anyone to one of these basic worldviews carries with it a threat, because if they become completely convinced that this is true in an absolutely metaphysical sense, it's extremely important that they also believe, as a derivative of their worldview, that there is a process by means of which people can freely participate in deciding whether or not they're going to believe this. And that's why they differ as they move from the right to the left, from those who insist that you believe the way they do, to those that are going to do everything they can do to compel you to believe it, all the way to the other end, where at the ultimate position, basically they just are. The gurus and other thoroughly evolved beings just present themselves and assume that people are going to be able to pick up on the vibrational frequency, to resonate with it, and be persuaded that they ought to figure out what's going on with this person. And so therefore they have to find out, how did you get this way? What is it you eat? Would you meditate? What type of practices do you follow? And then they will talk about it. A classic example of this is the Buddha. The Buddha, after spending 6 years in meditation, came back to his community where he had previously been a member of this aesthetic community. And he didn't try to foist any beliefs on them or anything. He just stayed with them, and after a short period of time, they began to ask him how it is that he had come to be now like he is. And then he would share his feelings with them, and this became a set of practices and beliefs. And so that the degree to which the adherence to any one of these worldviews allows for a free process by means of which people can either choose to adopt or not adopt the beliefs that they share, differentiates the worldviews from each other. So this second paradigm worldview that I'm talking about right now, this reactionary worldview that believes that the universe is oscillating between the state of absolute energy and absolute mass, and they've been able to discern this dialectical dynamic taking place. They actually hold down this particular position, and they are constantly championing competition between a thesis and antithesis. And so that they see everything in kind of bipolar terms. And they believe that the confrontation between a thesis and an antithesis, accepting the proposition that you cannot absolutely determine what the truth of any matter is regarding these fundamental belief systems, that they believe that the competition between competing thesis and antithesis will inevitably generate a thesis, a synthesis of the two, because the confrontation will burn away the weaker aspects of both the thesis and the antithesis to generate a synthesis, and that the synthesis then becomes its own operating thesis and will then generate a new antithesis. And that this contest, this struggle between thesis and antithesis is the defining quality of the second paradigm. Okay? And the sixth paradigm that we're talking about, the natural law worldview that we're talking about over here, the progressive sixth paradigm worldview, the natural law worldview that we have been talking about, that I think the archetypal statement of this is the one that I quoted from Professor Crane Brinton back in December of 1967, where he basically postulated the operating belief of the sixth paradigm, that in fact our human species is evolving teleologically in a progressive direction, and just like they believe that the giraffes basically evolved this long neck in order to be able to eat from the higher leaves of the trees, the more tender leaves of the trees, that adherents to this particular believe that our human family is evolving a faculty by means of which we can directly and experientially discern the unitive phenomenon that bonds every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire universe into one single unified holistic whole. And that by means of that experience, we can experientially discern what form of conduct, individual or collective, on the part of our human family, comports with and harmonizes with the natural order of the universe, or is disharmonious to it. And so that this kind of cosmic belief system that characterizes the sixth paradigm worldview is the worldview that we'll be attributing to the progressives in the discussions about these fundamental rights, because they believe that these fundamental rights are essential for being able to have people be free enough to discover the existence of this faculty and talk about it and dialogue about it and be free of repression during this discussion. Yes?
I don't know, you say we are evolving a faculty to feel the rest of the universe, but isn't evolution based on natural selection? I feel like humans are just, like, everyone can live. If you have like Down syndrome, if you have some handicap, you're born, you can still survive and pass your dreams on. I feel like if anything, a subset of humanity would be developing this faculty,
Hey, what fact?
like a subset, just like, okay, so
Yeah.
the mutation happened in this area,
Mhm.
and their descendants are gonna have this. This part of the world is unaffected. But then that's kind of, it goes on to like, okay, well, if humans are gonna develop this faculty, then we have more intelligence, but it's just this part, and it kind of, I don't know, it kind of gives way to have intelligence and like some sort of like higher, like someone with more power, I guess, because the entire species can't be evolving as a whole because we're getting weaker, I guess,
We're getting weaker.
physically than we were thousands of years ago. I think we're definitely getting weaker. Our eyesight's getting bad. People who have, like, natural selection isn't a thing anymore, at least in the developed world, because, okay, you have bad eyesight, here's glasses. Oh, you can't. You
That's
were born.
partly a myth, but okay, I'll let you go with it.
No. Okay, well, no, I hear what you're saying.
Sorry.
I hear what you're saying. All I can say is that the adherents to the sixth paradigm worldview don't agree with you. Okay? And that's what these worldviews are all about. That's what free speech is all about. That's what the process is that's being talked about here. That the dialogue that goes on among and between adherents to these different worldviews is what free speech is all about. That you advocate your particular view. You cite Darwin. You cite, who is considerably misunderstood, by the way. But that people all dialogue about these different things that they've heard about, they've talked about, they've read about, and they share their ideas. And every single person is supposed to be, or depending upon how you move across the political spectrum here, is being more or less free to participate in reflecting upon these ideas to determine what she or he believes about this. And then you can comport your conduct in accordance with what you believe. But that virtually any one of these worldviews that I touch upon and start to describe, one could raise a question about it and say, well, wait a second, there are people who are adherents to another one of the worldviews that have a different position on that.
I guess then my question is, do people who believe in the sixth paradigm have a different idea of evolution? And
Absolutely. Absolutely do.
It's a foreign idea.
They're suggesting that the probabilities of an eyeball and brain developing just willy-nilly, and that it just happens to develop into what it is now, is a lot like taking all the individual nuts and bolts and pieces of a 757 and it being hit by a tornado. You take all these pieces and you spread them out across the world, and they get hit by tornadoes, that they would somehow all come together and form a 747. And they don't, and so they have a different attitude about evolution than the fourth paradigm scientific logical. Yes. No, just the students now. No, just the students, okay? So the bottom line is, the answer to your question is yes. They have a very definitely different idea about this. That they believe that, for example, that the stretched neck of a giraffe has taken place over tens of thousands of years, gravitating toward a particular objective, rather than just, every once in a while there's an animal born with a little bit longer neck, and they somehow search out and find another one with a long neck, and they happen to breed. So I'm saying is that they have different opinions about the issue of evolution. Absolutely they do. And in fact, they have different opinions about lots of things. And that's why they're so important. And that's why free speech is so important, so that they can dialogue with each other and discuss these issues, argue about these issues, present information and evidence in support of their different theories about this. And the fact of the matter is that at the present time, here in Western culture, in the United States, the kind of controlling paradigm, the dominant paradigm, is the fourth and the final one of the worldviews that we're going to be speaking about during the discussion of these rights, which is the fourth paradigm worldview, the scientific, logical, positivist worldview. And that this fourth paradigm worldview, the scientific, logical, positivist worldview, is the one that has interpreted, I might point out largely misinterpreted, Darwin into suggesting what you're suggesting about how evolution works. And so that there's a fourth paradigm opinion about how evolution works, and it's the one that is usually taught in most of the schools.
I don't think that species evolved with a purpose. Like that you're kind of implying like giraffes, the species as a whole knew it had to get along with them, and I kind of like there's some evidence like a tree, like I just know that like a little frog evolved from being completely green to looking like granite in 600 years. That made me question evolution.
It should.
It did. And I said, oh.
No, it doesn't make you question evolution. It makes you question the thesis of evolution that is being postulated by those who misinterpret Darwin.
But that's still it. I'm not sure if what you're implying is that a species is in it like on some subconscious higher level. One species is like just a thing, and it knows that okay, the next generation should strive to be born with such trait, or
Yeah.
are you implying like it's a bigger thing and it's not just that species and it's the entire Earth, the whole biosphere is this species should be born.
Or universe.
Or you like,
Or if you get to the seventh paradigm worldview, the infinite and eternal sea of consciousness that originally unfolded into being the entire physical universe has this intention. And that it's going to be evolving in a particular teleology. It's the teleological belief of the seventh paradigm worldview, absolutely. And so what I'm saying is that the type of distress that you're expressing right now is absolutely perfect, because that's exactly what you're supposed to be doing, because you've been exposed to the teachings of the fourth paradigm scientific, logical, positivist worldview, and one of the purposes of this course is to expose you to the other worldviews, and for you to try to understand that the reason that the adherents to the fourth paradigm scientific, logical, positivist worldview assert what they're asserting is because they have made arbitrary determinations as to what the answer to these four pillar questions are. And they're totally incapable of proving it, any more than any of the other people are. And yet they've attached themselves to a particular answer to those four questions, and predicated upon those answers, they have generated a principle that causes them to interpret evolution this way. And that's why when they run into the frog that looks exactly like granite, they don't know what the hell to say. Except that, a particular frog happened to have evolved to look just like granite, just out of the blue, and they happen to have found another one, a male, that happens to have had that same kind of complete accident of nature take place, and they find each other and mate, and then it becomes a dominant gene. And that's the theory of the fourth paradigm scientific, logical, positivist worldview. And it's okay, because what I'm advocating here in this class is that what you do is you do not, in fact, enter into the world of despair of the postmodernists, of saying that, look, just because it's clear that we can't answer definitively any one of these four pillar questions, that you should not, in fact, believe any of those worldviews. That you shouldn't believe any worldview at all. That, in fact, you have to remain completely skeptical, and they don't even endorse the scientific positive, logical positivist worldview, because they say, actually, lots of those scientific alleged proofs aren't really proof at all. So all I'm saying is, without getting bogged down on this particular point, what I'm suggesting is that what we do to be constructive here in this course is that we take a look at a limited number of these worldviews, and from their perspective, try to understand how it is and why it is they interpret these particular rights in a particular manner. That's what we're saying here. Okay, but this I'm extremely pleased to find you as distressed as you are. about this, because what you're really saying is that, well, it seems like the adherents to the sixth paradigm worldview fundamentally, in some sense, disagree with the assumptions of those who are adherents to the fourth paradigm worldview. And you're absolutely correct. They definitely do. They definitely do. Okay? And so that this fourth paradigm worldview that I want to raise now, the reason that I believe it needs to be one of the four that we take a look at is for just the reasons that we've been discussing. That this, in fact, has come to be the dominant worldview of Western culture at the present time, the scientific, logical, positivist worldview. That they believe that the only things that you can believe in are things that can be weighed and measured and tasted and seen, even if it's only by an amplification of the five faculties that we have through microscopes and telescopes and in amplification systems for hearing, etc. That these five senses are all that we have functioning, and that we can magnify those senses, and we can look at the things that we can see, touch, taste, and feel, and we can look at those things, and then we can through the application of logic in the intellect, we can discern inductively certain kind of arithmetic and algorithmic patterns that seem to exist in the observed nature, and then we can generate certain theorems or theses about what those patterns represent, and that these patterns are going to continue to be replicated, and that we can then make predictions predicated upon those patterns. And so that there's a fourth paradigm worldview that consciously acknowledges that there not only may very well be, but there are virtually certainly all kinds of dimensions of reality that they don't have anything to say about at all. That they just can't and won't say anything at all about those, other than acknowledging that they probably exist, but that they don't render any opinion about it because they haven't done enough experiments about it yet. And so that what they do is they consciously embrace a life that is predicated upon a partial worldview. The problem is that it starts to take on the power of myth. It starts to take on the power of almost a religious belief. And what they do is they start excoriating others who in fact postulate a different worldview. And that they actually get to the point now where they're treating it almost as heresy. That anyone who adheres to one of these other worldviews is a heretic, and in fact should be basically excluded from the academy of well-educated men and women. You see what I'm saying? And so that there begins to develop this kind of momentum on behalf of the fourth paradigm, scientific, logical, positivist worldview, that is advocating that everybody be a moderate. Everybody be a moderate, because other people are extremists. And extremists are dangerous, because extremists will do things and say things that we don't agree with as advocates and adherents to the fourth paradigm worldview. And what we want to do is we want to be able to analyze this as these particular perspectives apply to starting out with this issue of free speech. And so the reason that I want to identify these four particular worldviews: the authoritarian worldview, the reactionary worldview, the sixth paradigm natural law worldview, and the fourth paradigm scientific, logical, positivist worldview, or materialist worldview, if you will. That because from a strictly political point of view, they're extremely important. Because the fourth paradigm worldview has come to dominate not only the academy and the political discourse in the scientific community, but it also represents four of the 9 justices on the United States Supreme Court, and one of the two political parties, the Democratic political party. And the reactionary worldview is salient because it's coming to become more and more dominant in the Republican Party. And the 5 of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court are adherents to this worldview. And therefore, you can predict pretty much what they're going to say and do. And if you're going to be arguing in front of them, And you're not going to be surprised at all when they ask you a specific question, because it's coming directly from their worldview. Okay? And so that they're trying to determine whether or not you agree with their worldview adequately, that they're going to vote for you the way you want this case to be disposed of. So that's why this is so important. Thomas.
So I'm kind of interested as to how you, because you've argued against the Supreme Court, how one goes about convincing these people if they're reactionary or they have a specific worldview and your worldview doesn't align with them. Because if you just say what you believe in and you know that they're going to disagree with you, then that's it. They're just going to disagree with you.
Yeah.
If you just conform to the whole groupthink idea and agree with their worldview.
Well, that's why I don't spend much time talking to them anymore. You know, there was a point in time when I used to spend a lot of time talking to them. You know, and there were justices there who were open to listening to things, but they're totally closed-minded now. And so the fact is that virtually every Supreme Court advocate now that you could talk to, if you get them alone in a room and talk to them privately, they'll say all that they care about is Justice Kennedy. Because they know perfectly well how the 4 moderates are going to vote, and they know how the 4 reactionaries are going to vote, and so they're constantly trying to figure out what to do about Justice Kennedy. Because Justice Kennedy he's kind of in between worldviews, and so that they can get to him. Okay, but you look, I mean, just look at virtually every one of the Supreme Court decisions that are going to be coming out in June, because they all hold off until June, the really major cases. The 4, 5, 6 cases that are the major cases, they hold off until June to hand down the decisions, and you watch the split. You're going to see 5-4 decisions in 95% of those cases, and then you may catch a 6-3 because Breyer once in a while goes back and forth. Okay, but I don't want to get too deeply into this. I want to move in. I want to get us to deal with the first the free speech here. But yes.
You're saying about free speech and opening up a dialogue between the people, and how is not talking to them solving anything?
Oh, because these aren't normal people. In talking with people on the Supreme Court, they've been politically chosen and appointed by executive branch officials and or approved by the Republican or Democratic Party in the Senate to sit on the point and to advocate a particular position. So that they're not neutral parties. They're not people who are anymore subject to actual persuasion. If you were going to engage them, if you were going to have an ideal Supreme Court, what you would have is a representative on the bench of each of the 8 worldviews, and then you'd have a Chief Justice whose job it was to get them to come to some kind of an agreement, so that you could get at least 5 of them to agree to at least what the outcome ought to be in the case, even if they didn't all agree as to what the reason for having that outcome would be. And so that would be basically the ideal way to do it. And an advocate that would be coming before the court would actually say, when Justice Scalia asks you a question, you would say, Justice Scalia, I understand that you're a reactionary, and that therefore, even predicated upon your own belief system, let me explain to you why at least the outcome of this ought to be the way I want it to be, even if you don't agree with me as to what the reasons are that happen to persuade me. And then that's how you would do it, you see? I'll touch upon as we get into this thing. I argued a case in front of an all-Mormon jury in Idaho, and the judge was the president of the Mormon stake, 1/3 of the state. And I was actually representing United Artists defending The Last Tango in Paris by Bertolucci, starring Marlon Brando, which, when the city council saw the movie, actually what happened on the night that the movie opened in Idaho Falls, in Idaho, the district attorney sent the assistant district attorney and 4 uniformed police officers to go to the 7 o'clock show to see it. And they sent 2 other police officers who stood next to the ticket booth taking Polaroid photographs of each person who came up to purchase a ticket to go to the movie, demanding to see their license and identification, and copying down their name and address and identification if they were going to be buying a ticket to the movie. And then the 4 uniformed police officers and the assistant district attorney went into the movie theater, watched the movie, came out, and went directly back to the district attorney's office and signed affidavits saying that they thought that this movie was contrary to the community standards. At which point, the district attorney with the 4 uniformed police officers went out to the theater, back to the theater, and prior to the 9 o'clock showing of the theater, went upstairs into the projection booth and seized the film off the reel and put it back in the can and took it back to the district attorney's office and locked it in the safe. Okay, so this is a kind of dramatic manifestation of the fact that they didn't want said what was in that film. They didn't want their people to even have the right to go see it. Okay, so that we're not talking completely abstract hypotheticals here, you know. Whereas, you know, William O. Douglas, if he was a member of the Supreme Court at the time, that if he had been the judge in that, he would have immediately arrested all those people for doing that. You know, saying this is a gross, you know, criminal conspiracy to violate the First Amendment. And you all ought to be put in federal prison, you know, under Title 18, Section 271. But he wasn't there. They had Judge Thomas instead, who, as I said, was the president of the Mormon stake. And so when I was examining the potential jurors, and I asked Mrs. Frank G. Thomas, who was this 95-year-old woman who was sitting on the potential jury pool, and I said, Mrs. Thomas, I said, you know that during the course of this trial, you're going to have to be viewing a certain number of motion pictures, you know. And the judge pounded the gavel like this. He said, no. He says, I haven't made any such decision yet. I'm not sure I'm going to allow this jury to see any films at all, including the one that's at issue here. He said, so go on to the next question. And so I said, well, let me ask you this, Ms. Thomas. I said, since it's my belief, at least, that you're going to have to see a number of motion pictures here during the course of the trial, can you tell me approximately how many motion pictures a year do you see? And she said, I haven't been to a motion picture show since 1936, she said. I said, really? I said, and why is that? And she said, because they're unchristian. And I said, really? They're unchristian? I said, in what regard? She said, well, the women appear in these movies without even any stockings on, she said. So I said, really? I said, can you tell me why you think not wearing stockings is unchristian? At which point the judge pounded the gavel and said, that's enough of this. He said, okay. He said, we're going to adjourn into chambers. Mrs. Thomas, you come with us. And so we go into chambers, and Joe Durham, who was terrified, sitting to my left, my co-counsel, and we go into chambers, and the judge sits Mrs. Thomas down in Thompson, her name was, down in the seat, and he pulls his chair right up in front of her, and he puts his knees right up against her knees and looks her in the face like this, with us, the prosecutor and the defense of us sitting on the side. He said, now, Mrs. Thompson, he said, you know your friends and neighbors have asked you to sit on this jury. You know that, don't you? And she said, well, yes. And he said, now, you don't think that if you sit on this jury that there's going to come a point in time when you're going to have to look your Creator in the eye as you are me now and have to answer for this, do you? And she said, why, no. Fine. He said, there'll be no more questions of this jury. She's going to sit on this jury. He said, and so he seated her on the jury, okay? So this is what I had to deal with. And so we ended up having a jury of 12 people, every single one of whom was a member of the Church of the Latter-day Saints. And so after I'd been thrown out twice from the courtroom, I was finally ordered back in by the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, and I came back in, and I was doing the closing to the jury, and I said, now you've heard a lot of stuff. You've seen a number of films here in the course of this, including the major film you had to see. And now I'd like to let you know that I'm completely confident that you're going to vote to acquit the owner of the theater here on the charges of obscenity, because, as you know and I know, the Constitution of the United States, including the First Amendment, all importantly, are divine documents, and that they come directly from the will of God, and that if in fact you vote against it, you will all go to hell. Which was the third time I was thrown out of the courtroom in that particular case, and they all voted unanimously to acquit. So you see that you can do it. You can do it. Now you might say that, well, that was a terrible thing for you to say, that it was a divinely created instrument and that they would all go to hell if they voted to convict them. But the fact is, it was true, as far as they were concerned. You see? And the fact is that if I wasn't going to be completely arbitrary and capricious and attach myself to one of these worldviews or another, I had the obligation to communicate with them in terms that they completely agreed with. And the judge agreed with too, except for him throwing me out. I mean, this is what I'm trying to explain to you, is that if you familiarize yourself with these particular worldviews and you understand these constitutional rights from the perspective of these different worldviews, you are then capable, you are basically multilingual. And just like there's nothing wrong with addressing a jury in Spanish if that's what they understand, you know, there's nothing awful about talking to the people in Spanish if that's their native language. And so there's nothing wrong with talking with a person who is an adherent to one of these worldviews from the perspective of their own worldview to ascertain what they think they ought to do about this. And all that you care about is the result. All you care about is that they agree to do the particular thing. They may have a completely different set of reasons for doing it. As long as you believe completely, confidently, predicated upon your worldview, that that's the right thing to do. Okay? You're not lying to them. You're not deceiving them. You're not doing anything. You're just becoming fluent in their language, in their worldview. Yes? What's your name, so I remember?
My name is Sarah.
Sarah.
I feel like you would be deceiving them, but with intelligence. Like, language is just, you can play so many tricks with language. Like, so much is lost in translation. What someone says, someone interprets, and it's completely different, even though what you get is the same. Like, I don't know, how could you fix a system that's based off of language, which is based off of something that isn't logical and, like, can be...
That isn't but it is logical.
But you can have, but it's not. Language...
It's logical if you assume certain answers to these questions. If you assume certain answers to these questions, then all the rest of it flows
But
logically.
assuming that isn't logical...
No. Assuming what isn't logical?
Assuming answers to those questions without any proof is not a logical thing to do.
Well, it's not without any proof. There are reasons why people believe one or another of these answers. And I mean, we could spend a whole course on that, you know. But the people who believe one or another of these sets of answers to the four pillar questions are not irrational. That's how they got to be whole worldviews. Okay?
Is there one worldview that correlates most with an agnostic viewpoint? Like
Fourth paradigm worldview. Your worldview. The one you're asking all the questions from, the perspective of. That's the fourth paradigm worldview. And that's the one that you've been handed. That's the one you've been taught. That's the one that you will continue to be taught in most Western portions of the academy. Okay? And so that you're right in attempting to ask questions from that perspective to see what the answers are, because you're still in the exploratory period, hopefully, at the college level, of trying to determine whether or not that's a consistent worldview or not. Okay? So that's what the course is really all about here, is trying to get you to become multilingual with regard to these worldviews, specifically with regard to the constitutional rights, because you're going to be challenged by the upcoming major crisis. You're going to be confronted. There's going to be terrible things going on in the world. Massive dislocation, as I've talked about, massive depletions of drinking water, etc. And people are going to become irrational. People are going to become violent and confrontational. And so that there's going to have to be some people who are going to remain centered and calm and try to have intelligent discourse about what the options are that we have as a community to respond to these crises. And that's what I'm hoping to try to help train you to do. Okay? So that these are the four worldviews from the perspective of which we're going to be talking about free speech to begin this process of moving into the Bill of Rights. Okay? And let us turn now again to start talking about freedom of speech. Okay? Now, as I said, and I want to repeat, the reason that the freedom of speech is viewed to be the great grandfather of all of the basic fundamental rights is because so many other rights flow from it. For example, even though the First Amendment says that Congress shall pass no law abridging the freedom of speech, it's been perfectly logical that people have interpreted this, and the courts have interpreted this, as including freedom of expression. Because there are means of communicating with other human beings that you don't have to speak out loud. That you can gesture, you can draw pictures, you can make sculptures, you can do all kinds of things. You can do music, you can do all. It's a method of expressing yourself, and to the extent to which, if you, for example, can create music that moves people emotionally, moves people spiritually, to the extent to which you do that, you're communicating with them. You're having some effect upon their thought processes. And they've also interpreted it not only to include freedom of expression, but also freedom of thought. Because that while it may well be true that a person can think anything that she or he wants to think, and the state can't really tell until you talk. See, and as soon as you start speaking, they're going to start getting some evidence as to what you think. And they don't want you thinking a certain way. You know, the farther you move to the right of the political spectrum here, the less they want you thinking at all. You know, they want you doing what it is you're supposed to do. They don't want you questioning it. They don't want you challenging it. They certainly don't want you speaking out against it. And so therefore, the best way to keep you from speaking out against it is to have you not think like that. And so that this whole issue of freedom of thought is at the core of the issue of freedom of speech. And it's been logically discerned that that would be true. Okay? And so that this issue of freedom of thought is directly related to freedom of belief. Because predicated upon what you think is what you believe. Okay? And so your political belief, the belief as to how you think the community ought to go about making collective decisions about challenges that confront us, has to do with your political belief. Hey, yes, I'm sorry, is it your name?
Mickey.
Mickey, all right.
Would blocking a highway be part of the freedom of expression?
No, that's what they call speech plus. You know, my taking my pants off and walking around in the front of the room isn't necessarily just speech. You know, and so that there's this whole category of what they call speech plus, and then there's a whole discussion that's going to go on about that. We'll get to that. Okay, so that but these profound ideas about freedom of thought and freedom of belief are directly linked to your freedom to express yourself, and that's all directly linked usually to speech. And it's all considered under the category of speech that is one of the first premises of the First Amendment, of all of them. It's that everybody ought to be allowed to speak freely, okay? Because it is in fact also at the root of your freedom of religion and your freedom of association. So, what I want to do is I want to point out there's a number of this whole idea of freedom of thought and freedom of belief is not surprisingly and not coincidentally is a major theme of literature in Western civilization. That you have everything from George Orwell's 1984 with Big Brother that was constantly attempting to propagandize everybody into believing what it is that the state wanted them to believe. There's Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, which was all about book burning. That there was a culture in which they burnt books. And the main protagonist in the story was what they called a fireman, who was one of the ones who went around burning the books. And there was this whole process that developed during Ray Bradbury's novel about how this person began to growingly question the legitimacy of what it is that he was doing. There's this Perfect Day, one that you almost certainly haven't read, but Ira Levin wrote this book called This Perfect Day, which is a fabulous piece of work, and it talks about a young 12-year-old boy who is a perfect young boy in this future community that he's in, except that he's got one brown eye and one blue eye. And what happens is that at the end of every month, everybody in this one, and the community is absolutely wonderful. You know, they're sharing, caring people. They in fact don't support war. I mean, if you could sit down and kind of hypothesize a complete kind of utopia, this book represents it. And so that there's no specific substantive thing that you could disagree with them about, except for the fact that everybody has to believe it. And everybody has to go along with it. And what they do is at the end of each month, every person goes into this little booth, like a little telephone booth, and you stick your arm into this little sleeve, and they take a little blood sample, and then it tests your blood, and what it does is it then gives you a little shot of exactly what it is you need. You know, whether it's vitamins that you're a little short on, or hormones of a particular kind that you're a little short on, or other minerals, and so that in this young boy who's the protagonist of the story, every time he comes toward the end of the month, he starts getting strange feelings that there's something a little wrong with this culture. That he's getting ready when he turns 13 to have to go and take a test that'll determine what direction he's going to be going in school, what things he's going to be allowed to study, what books he's going to be allowed to read, etc. And he's going to be trained to have a particular career or vocation for his community. And he starts to question why it is that he doesn't have a right to decide himself as to which one of these things he wants to do or what path he wants to follow. And so he decides that he recognizes that these questions that he has, questions similar to like you were asking, Sarah, that he started to get conflicted or troubled by this thing. And what he would do, so he decided that it kept getting stronger as he moved toward the end of each month. So he decided it had something to do with this shot that he would get, because when he would get the shot and he'd come out of the thing, he stopped thinking about all those things. And he didn't worry about any of those things. And so what he decided to do was to put a little pad on his arm. And when he stuck his arm in his sleeve, they took the little blood sample, but he put a pad over his arm, so when they gave him the shot, it didn't go in, it just went into the pad. And then when he left, he continued to have those same thoughts. And so he began to ignore those shots at the end of each month, and after a few months, he was definitely concerned about what was going on in his culture. And so he wanted to go and read some books that he wasn't allowed to read. And so what he did is he would get up at night when he wasn't supposed to be up, because he needed his sleep. He had to be healthy. But he would get up and he would wander out into the town. And the governors of the town, the community in the town, were so confident that everybody would do what they're supposed to do, they didn't have any guards. So he would just get out and wander around, and he would go to this part of the town where the library was, and they had these little pedestals that had a little bulb on the top of them, and you'd put your hand on it, and if it turned green, you were allowed to go into that other zone, and if it turned red, you weren't allowed to. You didn't know why or didn't care why usually, and so you just weren't allowed to go. So he wouldn't even put his hand on it. He would just go to the library, and he was starting to learn, and he started meeting other people, young kids who had snuck out at night and were coming to the library, and that they'd stopped taking their shots. And so this entire story of this perfect day is a classic example, but in fact, kind of 180 degrees different than George Orwell's 1984, because George Orwell had everything that the state was doing being distasteful. Whereas in This Perfect Day, Ira Levin had everything that the state was doing being perfectly sound. It seemed like a perfectly good idea, except for the fact that you didn't get to make a choice. And so this book postulates that issue very aggressive. And I've done a number of cases other than the case of what we call the last tango in Idaho. We had this other case in Idaho. This is when I did all the trials for ACLU National for 10 states in the country. And another one of the cases we had in Idaho was Rufus Lyman. Professor Rufus Lyman was the chairman of the Natural Sciences Department at Idaho State University. He was tenured for 20 years there, and what happened is the president of the university passed away in 1973, and so the Board of Education in the state of Idaho was halfway through the school year. And so they decided that rather than have some kind of emergency process of selecting a new president, they would temporarily select someone to serve in the position of the acting president of Idaho State University for the remainder of the school year. And they picked Bud Davis, who was the coach of the football team for the university. Now, this particular football team had lost every game except one game a year, basically for the last 5 years. They were atrocious. And what Bud Davis decided he was going to do once he became president was move funds out of the academic side of the university over to build a mini domed stadium for the football team. And Rufus Lyman decided that he wanted to call meetings of the faculty members to oppose that. And so he started calling meetings, and he was the president of the Association of University Professors, the chapter, which is the big union for professors around the country. And he started holding meetings. And in one of the meetings, he stated that he thought that Coach Davis, Coach Bud Davis, had played too much football without a helmet. And Bud Davis heard about this, and he was so angry about it that he contacted the State Board of Education and asked them to hold a special emergency meeting. He went to the State Board of Education special meeting, and at the end of the meeting, at about 6 o'clock in the afternoon, after they got all done with the meeting, they came out and they held a public press conference. Now, they weren't too good at this because after 6 o'clock, the 6 o'clock news is all over, and so they missed the entire news cycle for the day. But they come out and they hold this little mini press conference, and they state that the State Board of Education in Idaho is going to be establishing an ad hoc committee, all the members of which are going to be chosen from the faculty at Idaho State University, and they're going to be selected by President Bud Davis. And anyone who has any complaints about Professor Rufus Lyman, whether they're students or faculty members or alumni or parents of the students or community members, anybody who has any complaints at all about Professor Rufus Lyman are to send them to this committee. And so they hold this press conference. And given the fact they've missed the news cycle, the news media call Professor Lyman. And they tell him about this. And they ask him what his thoughts are. And he said, well, this is a star chamber. Now, a star chamber was a very specific thing that used to exist in England back in the 13th century, and it was when the king was pissed off at anybody. What he would do is he would gather together some of his advisors, and he would put them together in this chamber that had stars on the ceiling. It had to be called the star chamber, and ask anybody in the community to come in and had any complaints about this person that the king wanted to do something about. And they would just cull through all of these different complaints till they found something to go after this person about, and then they would punish the person for it. Okay, so Rufus Lyman, having been well-read, knew what a star chamber was. So the following morning, there's on all the front pages of the two major newspapers in the state, and on all three statewide television shows, the interview with him declaring this committee to be a star chamber and having a discussion about what a star chamber was, because nobody knew what it was. So they started and so they got so angry that John Schwartley, who was the president of the State Board of Education, got on the telephone and called all the members of the State Board of Education, and they all voted to fire him. Even though he was a tenured professor for 20 years, they fire him for insubordination. And so they fire him, and so he calls ACLU National in New York, and they call us because we were in charge of these 10 states, included Idaho. So we go in to represent Rufus Lyman. And we end up... I ended up subpoenaing the private secretary for John Schwartley, who was the president of the State Board of Education. I subpoenaed her and served her with a subpoena duce tecum, which requires her to bring in certain documents and stuff, demanding that she bring in the recorded copy of the transcript of all that happened in the meeting. And so, and then I hold the deposition of her in the public library in downtown Pocatello, and invited the entire public to come. And so we had like 200 people in the library, and we had this little table where she was going to be doing the deposition. So she comes in, and I swore her under oath, got her sworn in, and I said, okay, now you've been subpoenaed, to bring the recording of the hearings. And she said, yes, I know that. And I said, well, do you have it with you? She said, no, I don't have it. And I said, well, where is it? She said, it's been destroyed. And I said, really? I said, who destroyed it? She said, I did. And I said, well, why did you do that? And she said, well, Dr. Schwartley told me to do it. And so everybody, there was this dead silence in the entire library, right? We were all sitting there. And I just said, how long have you been Dr. Schwartley's secretary? She said, for 20 years. And I said, how long has he been the president of the State Board of Education? She says, 15 years. And I said, well, how long is it they've been recording these things on tape recorders? She said, only just about the last 5 years or so. And I said, well, then I'll bet that prior to their recording these things that you used to take handwritten notes, didn't you, in all of these meetings? And she said, yes, I did. And I said, I'll bet you still do, don't you? And she said, well, yes, I do, as a matter of fact. And I said, where are those notes? And she said, well, they're at my home. And I said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to temporarily adjourn the deposition. No one is going to leave this room except you. Okay? You're going to go home. You're going to get those notes. You're going to bring them back here. You're going to remain under oath, and you're not to talk to a soul about this. You're going to come back, and you're going to bring those back to us. So she leaves, and she comes back about 40 minutes later. She comes back, and she sits back down. I said, now you're still under oath. I want you to open up your notes, and I want you to read them to us. She starts reading through the notes. Dr. Schwartley, how did we get rid of this bastard? He's got tenure. Okay? And Bud Davis saying, I don't care how you get rid of him, but you got to get rid of him. He's criticizing us. I'm not going to stand for being criticized like this. I won't stay on as the president unless you get rid of him. So, a question from another one of the Board of Education. How the hell are we going to get rid of him? He's got tenure. We got to figure out some way to get rid of him. And so she's reading these things. So she gets done reading them, and we adjourn. And I say, now look at, nobody in this room is going to talk to another soul about what's happened here, or I will personally move to have you held in criminal contempt of court. And everybody froze like that. And so we leave. I had the deposition scheduled to immediately follow after this one in the courthouse. And we had Dr. John Schwartley ordered to come and into the courtroom where we would do the trial. And he had to sit in the witness stand. And so we go right straight there, and there he is waiting for us. And we put him in the witness stand, and I put the question to him. I said, look, let's cut to the chase here, Dr. Schwartley. Did you or did you not say regarding Professor Lyman, how do we get rid of this bastard? He's got tenure. And he just turned kind of purple. And he looked kind of desperately around trying to figure out how in the world we knew this. And I said, now remember, you're under oath. And I tell you, if you commit perjury, I will put you in prison for 6 months, I said. And he said, like that. So I said, let me ask you another question. I said, isn't it in fact true that you also said, we have to figure out some way to get rid of this bastard, or else we're not going to have Bud Davis as the president anymore? Didn't you say that? And now he knew that we knew. And he was just desperate. He started breathing hard and turning red and holding onto his chest and wheezing. And the guy who was his lawyer, it wasn't the state attorney general who was going to be his lawyer, because I had threatened to put him in prison if he represented him. And so they'd hired this guy, Jess Hawley, who coincidentally turned out to be the grandson of Jess Hawley the first, who was the Attorney General of the state of Idaho, who prosecuted Big Bill Haywood, who was the president of the International Miners that waged war against the state of Idaho back in 1893. And so I had the right guy representing him. And so he jumped up and said, wait a second, something's wrong with him. I said, yes, there is. He's lying. So sit down, and we're going to get to this. And I said, look at Dr. Schwartley, you've got the chance here to testify honestly about what happened. You know we know. So if you commit perjury, you're going to prison. And I want you to know that. And he went, and he sags down and falls on the floor out of the witness stand. And I said, okay, we're going to give him a 2-minute break here. I said, a 2-minute, everybody stay away from him. Nobody's going to talk to him. You got 2 minutes, okay? And so he gets up out of the stand, he gets up and he wanders out into the hall. I was pissed off at myself for giving this guy a break, right? So I say, I go out into the hall, and here they are all clatched together, and I say, I'm going to go take a leak. Well, I got time. So I wander off, and I go off into the bathroom, and I walk in, and there's Dr. Schwartley, up against the wall like this, and he sees me come in, and he goes, no. And I said, yes. I said, all you have to do is tell the truth. Look, all we're trying to do is get to the truth. I'm not here after you. Just tell me the truth. He says, I can't. He says he sags down and passes out. And they bring an ambulance. I go outside and say, I think maybe he needs some help here. And they bring an ambulance. They bring him to the hospital, and he has open heart surgery that afternoon. And we then move to take the depositions of 3 of the other board members. Of the 5 board members, swear to God, this is true, every single one of them had gone and had open heart surgery. Elective open heart surgery, bypasses, to refuse to come to our deposition. So we bring on a motion for summary judgment in front of the judge, using the notes from the secretary as the witness, and had her available as a witness. So we come into the courtroom. The judge is sitting there, and the 2 remaining members of the board were there, along with Jess Hawley, looking crestfallen. And the judge looks down on him. He says, "How are we doing today, gentlemen?" He said, "No heart problems here. Do we have any heart problems here today in the courtroom?" He said, and he entered a summary judgment against them, and ordered him back to be reinstated with all of his back pay. And he's the only guy in the state of Idaho that can say anything he wants to say for the rest of his life, and no one's going to hurt him. Okay, so these are the kind of things that you can do. There's no doubt that the entire state of Idaho wanted to get him out of there. All the officials, everybody. But the fact is, armed with the First Amendment, right to free speech, you can, in fact, wade into the heart of the beast, and you can confront them with what it is that they themselves have sworn to abide by. Okay? And so this is a fundamental bedrock of the entire government. And so that those who rely upon the authority of government can be pushed into a position of having to confirm and affirm these rights. Because if they let go of these rights, then chaos can reign from their perspective. That the people can rise up against them. The people will rise up against them if they consistently violate these fundamental rights. And so what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be discussing with you today and Thursday the philosophical underpinnings of this concept of free speech. There's a whole lot of reading that you can do about this if you'd like. That we haven't given you specific assignments on the First Amendment, but there's lots of different essays and things about the First Amendment, the philosophical predicates of the First Amendment. But what you're going to find out is there are different theories. I'll give them to you, and I want you to look up some of this stuff because I'm going to ask you some questions on Thursday about this. Okay, because we'll have the seating chart by that time. Okay, and that there are going to be like a handful of different theories about why it is that the free speech is so important. We're going to on Thursday. We're going to go over these four worldviews as to what position is taken by the adherents to each of these four worldviews on free speech. But I want you to take a look at some of the following because you aren't going to find a lot of that stuff. But what you will find is there are going to be lots of essays about things, for example, of the idea that the reason why we have to allow people to speak and say things even if we don't agree with them is because it's possible that they might be correct. Because we aren't in a position of wanting to authorize the state to determine what is true or not true. And so for them to be prosecuting someone and punishing them for what they're saying on the grounds that they say it's not true, they refer to this as the marketplace of ideas. That in fact, the cure for a disagreement with someone's free speech is more free speech. And you set forth your arguments against them, and then the people, it's like a marketplace of free ideas. And the people can all weigh the ideas respectively and decide which of them they are going to believe in. And so therefore, there is a utilitarian, fourth paradigm, majoritarian utilitarian reason for allowing free speech from a strictly practical point of view, because it helps us get to potential truth. A second thing I want you to look up and see what you think about this one, and that is that the actual concept of self-governance itself is predicated upon the individual citizens being well-informed. And if people are going to be well-informed, they have to have freedom to talk about different ideas. And people need to be free to speak up on behalf of different ideas so that the people can participate in this discussion and engage in the process of self-governance. So that the basic concept of democracy itself, aside from the metaphysical search for truth, which is the first rationale for this. Second rationale is that it's an essential element, a utilitarian element, for self-governance. Okay? Then there is a third one, which is pushing farther to the left here, in that is the concept of self-fulfillment. That at the base of the Constitution of the United States and the concept of democracy and self-government is to have all of our people, all of our citizens free to better themselves, to perfect all of their talents and their abilities, to contribute to the community all of their talents and skill sets. And in order to do this, they have to be free and untrammeled in their exploration of ideas. They need to develop their own sense of conscience. They have to develop their own sense of beliefs in the world. And therefore, the whole idea of self-fulfillment requires that a person be free to develop their own thoughts and beliefs. And that's a more profound requirement for a culture. Now, there are other more prosaic ones. For example, the safety valve theory, and that is that look, if you don't allow your people to speak out against government policies or things in the society that they don't like, they're going to build up and build up and build up more hostility toward the government, and they could riot, like we see happening, in Baltimore now. If the people don't have any means of resolving their opposition to certain government policies, etc., they could revolt, and you don't want people engaging in revolution. So you have to have a safety valve to allow them to blow off steam and to express themselves and to engage in activity of that kind. So those are three of the rationales that are set forth for free speech. And I want you to look into each of those three and let me know what you think about them and be ready to talk about it on Thursday. And what I will do is I will review for you what the perspective on the free speech is from the perspective of each of these four major worldviews. And then we'll be able to meet and talk about it and have it be the subject for our Thursday afternoon section meeting as well. Okay, so there's going to be a lot of discussion about the free speech on Thursday. So I want you to get ready for it, and I want you to participate. Okay, and I'll have your essays, your first essays, back to you on Thursday. I'll give them to you at the end of the class, so you won't be reading them all during the class. Okay, great. Thank you, kids. I appreciate it.